Module 4, Bone Growth and Bone Remodeling. Most people think that bone is made up of non-living tissue and that it cannot change. Of course, when a young person is growing, we know the bones must be growing too. However, even when a person stops growing, their bones continue to change. When I talked about long bones, I mentioned how they have three major components: the diaphysis, the epiphysis, and the epiphyseal line, separating the two. Well, when you are young, the epiphyseal line is called an epiphyseal plate, made of about 1 millimeter's thickness of hyaline cartilage. The chondrocytes, or cartilage cells, that are near the epiphysis undergo mitosis to make new cartilage. And while that's happening, the old chondrocytes on the diaphysis side of the plate are maturing and enlarging to make their lacunae larger. As they are maturing, calcium salts accumulate, the chondrocytes die, and the empty lacunae are left. This is then calcified cartilage. Now there are spaces for blood vessels to grow into. Once a blood supply is established in this area, osteoblasts travel in and lay bone matrix on top of the calcified cartilage. This forms new cancellous bone. You can now see why there are lots of holes in cancellous bone. This entire process is called ossification. Where there was once cartilage, there is now bone. So as the epiphyseal plates are making cartilage on the epiphyseal side of the plate, older cartilage on the diaphyseal side is maturing, then dies, allowing blood vessels to come in and bring bone-forming cells. This way the epiphyseal plates never get any thicker, but the bone lengthens, and that's how you grow. Once a person is mature and certain hormones are released, the cartilage at the epiphyseal plates becomes ossified too, leaving a line of bone tissue in its place. This area is now called the epiphyseal line. Now, this whole process can also happen on the epiphysis of the bone too. You see, the cells of the articular cartilage on the end of the bone can undergo mitosis. Then the inner cartilage ossifies, creating new bone in the epiphysis. But there's always articular cartilage at the end of the bone because bones need to be able to move smoothly at their joints. Now, if you were to compare the sizes of the femur of a football player with the femur of a toddler, you would notice that the bones not only differ in length, but also in thickness. When bones grow, they grow in length and in diameter. To grow in diameter, osteoblasts create new bone matrix on the bone's surface. We call this appositional bone growth. While this happens, the osteoclasts break down some of the bone in the medullary cavity to make it larger too. Now you can see why osteoclasts are needed for growth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, even when you are fully grown, your bones are dynamic. As a bone is aging, osteoclasts break it down so it can be rebuilt. It's kind of like a continual upgrading process. This is called bone remodeling. Remember when I described how the bone grows at the epiphyseal plate? It resulted in cancellous bone. Well, what about compact bone? Where does that come from? Well, here's a good example. Say you have a back porch on your house that is very old and the supporting columns have begun to rot. You need to replace those columns with nice new ones. So when you remove them, you first set up an easy-to-install supporting column out of 2x4 wood, just to hold everything up. Then once you have received the nice new columns, you can replace the initial supporting structure with the more solid one. Well, cancellous bone is like those 2x4s. It's pretty easy to make and less organized or structured, even though it can provide decent support. Then it can slowly be replaced by the orderly, more tightly packed osteons of compact bone. And this is the way that all compact bone forms. It's first created as cancellous bone, then that material is replaced by a dense compact bone. Now, you need to know that not all cancellous bone is replaced by compact bone, but all compact bone was once cancellous bone. Got it? All right, another benefit of bone remodeling is its ability to strengthen itself if you need it to. If you regularly begin an exercise program of running, you are regularly bearing more weight on your bones. Your body identifies that you need more compact bone to be able to bear that additional stress, so the bones will create more compact bone. On the other hand, if a person becomes very inactive, the bones do not receive much stress, so the osteoclasts will begin to remove some of that compact bone tissue. Well, how do the bone cells know they need to create more dense bone? It has to do with the osteoblasts. You see, when they feel the stress of your running, walking, or even regular standing, they begin to secrete a protective shell around themselves, so they will be more protected. Well, that shell they create is more bone. If there's not much stress, the osteoblasts won't feel the need to secrete those protective shells or bone around them. But the osteoclasts will continue to do their job of breaking down old bone, thus resulting in less dense bones.
Your body also needs to remodel bones in order to change their shapes, too. A good example of this is when a person wears braces on their teeth. As the orthodontic gear creates pressure on the teeth in specific directions, your maxilla and mandible feel that pressure, and then they will remove bone in some areas and create bone in others to relieve that stress. You see, as a tooth is pulled in a certain direction, the ligaments feel that pull and begin to pull on the bone below it, so more bone is being produced in that spot. The ligaments on the other side of the tooth feel compression, so bone is removed by the osteoclasts that are located there. In this way, the actual tooth socket is changing its shape, but it's not always permanent. You see, the ligaments remember where they were before and often will want to move back to their original spot. So retainers are important to ensure that the tooth sockets keep their new shape. And as a matter of fact, this guy would probably benefit from a little bit of orthodontic work.
So bone remodeling is a result of the breaking down process of osteoclasts and the building up process of osteoblasts. In an earlier section, I mentioned that osteoclasts had more than one nucleus. In other words, they are multinucleate. Well, osteoclasts secrete acid to break down bone salts. Remember that the calcium salts in the bone matrix are primarily composed of hydroxyapatite. Well, the hydroxide ion in this molecule means that it is a base, and therefore when it is exposed to acid, it will dissolve along with the other ions in the hydroxyapatite molecule. Osteoclasts also secrete proteolytic enzymes that digest the collagen proteins in bone. We can see this process better when we look at how a broken bone heals. At the site of the breakage, the blood vessels and the periosteum are injured, so blood begins to flow out of the vessels, creating a hematoma. A hematoma is a mass of blood that is confined to an organ in some limited space. A bruise under your skin is also a hematoma. Well, the blood there begins to clot, which will stop the bleeding. Of course, now there is no good blood flow in the area around the damage, so the osteocytes at that spot cannot get nutrients and oxygen, and they begin to die. The blood clot then forms a callus. A callus is a mass of connective tissue that connects the ends of a broken bone. The callus that forms between the bones is called the internal callus, and it will gradually form new bone tissue. The callus that forms around the outside of the bone is called the external callus, and it is made of cartilage. Well, remember, cartilage is faster to make than bone, so it kind of supports the bone in this area until it can fully heal. It's kind of like when a carpenter is making a table and he glues pieces of wood together. While the glue dries, he uses clamps to hold everything in place until the glue is set. The cartilage formed from the external callus behaves like those clamps, keeping everything together until the bone tissue is formed. Well, while the calluses are forming, blood vessels begin to grow back into the internal callus. Then the fibroblasts begin to form collagen. Chondroblasts can then form cartilage among the collagen fibers. And to make sure the area is healing well, white blood cells are brought in via the blood vessels, attacking foreign cells and taking in dead cells. They do this via phagocytosis, engulfing the material of the blood clot and removing it. Simultaneously, osteoclasts begin to break down any dead bone tissue, while osteoblasts create new bone tissue. Any cartilage formed within the internal and external calluses eventually becomes ossified, resulting in cancellous bone tissue. Now bone remodeling begins. Osteoclasts can slowly break down cancellous bone in the external callus because it's no longer needed. It's kind of like removing those clamps holding the table together. Then the cancellous bone not in the external callus is remodeled into compact bone. And if the break happens in the diaphysis of a long bone, the material in the center of the bone is removed by osteoclasts in order to create a new medullary cavity. After a bone has healed from a break, you can usually still see where it was broken when you look at it in an X-ray. That's because the broken area is a bit thicker than the area around it due to some leftover external callus material. This whole healing process can take a while, depending on the size of the broken bone, where it is broken, and even the age of the individual. Like remodeling a house, remodeling a bone can take up to a year. But once the cancellous tissue has been formed, you're usually able to use the bone as before it was broken. This drawn-out process is actually a very good thing for us. You see, when your body has a broken bone, it repairs that area as quickly as it can with cancellous bone so that you can resume use of it. Then it comes back to the damaged area to do the slow process of making the compact bone. Otherwise, you'd be out of commission for a much longer time.